The following video is a recording of a lecture from Genes to Galaxies, the 35th Professor Harry Messel International Science School, presented to high-achieving Year 11 and 12 students from across Australia and 10 other countries.
Thank you very much, everybody. Can you hear me clearly at the back? I always ask that question because I feel so acutely for the people with hearing impairment. And yes, I'm a very grateful recipient of the products of physics research. So there's two computers in my head, and I wouldn't be standing here without the benefit of all those people that put efforts into development of a bionic ear. All right, I feel a little strange to be standing here talking to you when I know all the other speakers are taking you forward, making you look at all the cutting edge technologies and the stars and galaxies and the Milky Way. And what I'm doing here is asking you to look back as far as 4 million years ago. But I think it provides a paradigm, strange word, paradigm. It means that I want you to use it as the foundation idea of how you see the rest of human evolution. So I think you'll enjoy what I've got to say. All right. Okay, we're used to thinking about native diets. We think about native diets in the zoos, and when we're thinking about environmental needs of animals, we know that rats and mice were animals that ate seeds, tiny seeds. They will eat carrots now and again. And then we have one of our native animals. It looks like an owl, but it's actually called a frogmouth, the tawny frogmouth. It looks like a moth-eaten owl, and the owl eats the rodents, okay? And the meaning behind this slide is it's part of a food chain, and food chains were what we were part of as well. So we have books called Man the Hunter, that hunting shaped the evolution of humans, particularly the human brain. And then we have Man the Hunted, all right? We also had our predators, and there are stories of lions. We're very fearful of lions and tigers and things like that, but there were also birds that preyed on human babies. And if you're Australian, you may know the story of children who've been eaten by dingoes. And it's true. All right, so what would be the native human diet? We don't usually hear those words together, native human diet. It would be the diet which was established a long, long time ago. We're looking at millions of years, and it's a fair assumption that our genome, our genetic makeup, was shaped by these millions of years of evolution. What about the native diet of our cousins, our nearest cousins, so to speak? We are closest to the chimpanzee in terms of our genetic makeup. There's lots in common. I think it's at least 97% of our genetic makeup. And we know their native diet was 94% plant foods, chiefly ripe fruit, and that's an interesting point, because ripe fruit, the energy is sugars, all right? Not starch, but sugars. There's not much protein, there's not much fat, it's primarily sugars. There were some animal foods. They're not vegetarians. They do eat animals, they eat other primates, and they eat insects. And they have a large metabolically active gut. Anybody that's ever looked at orangutans and gorillas and chimpanzees in a zoo will know they have this big abdomen, and it's not full of fat, it's full of like a rumen in a cow. It's got lots of fermentation by microbial means. So that's interesting, but we're a long way from the chimpanzee. We think we separated off about 7 million years ago. Oh, this is one of the slides that's been muddled. Okay, the best we can do. Here we've got about 4 million years ago, we've got Australopithecus afarensis, and you can see over 4 million years we start to get taller at about this point here. This is the first member of the hominid, or the first member of our genus, Homo, and you can see we got taller and taller, and in fact our brains tripled in size. And that's an interesting point too, because many people think that that during human evolution, many people think we sort of we were half starving most of the time. They think that we lived from hand to mouth, so to speak. But in fact, that's probably not true. We wouldn't have got taller and taller, and we certainly wouldn't have developed an organ that is really very energy demanding, our brain. So what we know is that humans evolved as hunter-gatherers, that we separated from Australopithecus about 2.4 million years ago. That was Homo habilis. And habilis because he was handy. And we've occupied this niche called the hunter-gatherer niche for most of the last 2.5 million years ago, right up until 10,000 years ago, which corresponds to the dawn of agriculture. But if you think of our evolution on a 24-hour clock, or a 12-hour clock, the last 10,000 years corresponds to the last few seconds on that 12-hour clock. So what happened in the last 10,000 years is probably not shaping our genome to any great degree. So the questions that we ask in nutrition is, are we genetically adapted to the hunter-gatherer diet? We think that the selective pressures behind the hunter-gatherer diet would have selected for certain enzymes, certain pathways, certain proteins, and it's likely to have influenced our current makeup, including our nutritional requirements. Okay? We're one of the few species that actually require vitamin C in our diet. Most animals don't. Most mammals don't. Your dog doesn't, your cat doesn't, the rabbit, they don't require vitamin C. But we do, and only a few species do. So, it's also important to remember that animal food is more than just the muscle tissue, more than just meat, all right? Animal food consumption includes the head parts. I'm just going to go back. I think that slide's in the wrong place, but I'll talk about it anyway. When we talk about animal foods, we're not just talking about the flesh or the muscle tissue, all right? The muscle tissue that goes around us is what we call meat, but we also ate every part of the animal, the brain, the nose, the eyes. In fact, they loved these organs, as we call them, and there is evidence that we liked the female animals best. Why did we like the female animals best? Who said that? Yeah. Why?
More fat.
Yeah, you're a smart group of people, aren't you? Very good. It's exactly right. We love fat, and females are fattier than men, and for good reason. We're meant to be that way, and they also like to eat the fetus. The fetus was the most tender part of the animal, and so most of the time the female animals would have been pregnant or lactating. All right, our modern diet is the product of not just the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, but also of the industrial revolution. And in that time, human conditions, our lifestyle, the amount of exercise we do and how we live, our sedentariness, the extent to which we sit down, has changed markedly. And it's changed the kinds of foods we eat, it's changed the quality of the food we eat. And especially the Industrial Revolution, which, roughly 200 years ago, for the first time we were able to refine things like cereals and oils and sugar. All right, so our nutritional requirements were established in the long ago past. Although we have a modern anatomy and a modern physiology, we don't have a big gut. Our nutritional requirements were probably established millions and millions of years ago. All right, we still need vitamin C, and probably that was because our diet has always provided large amounts of vitamin C. We never needed to synthesize it ourselves. It was always in the diet. A sign that fruit, at least, and perhaps, there's some vitamin C in organs like the liver, but a sign that fruit was also always plentiful. Okay, we have a hypothesis called the discordance hypothesis, which suggests that the reason that so many of us these days suffer from diseases like obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular or heart disease and stroke is because of this discordance between our modern diet, our modern lifestyle, and Paleolithic diets. And I'm not going to talk too much about that until the end. All right, so millions of years ago, going back at least 2.5 million years ago, the human condition has been subjected to one ice age after another. Ice ages generally last about 100,000 years. In between the ice ages are small interglacials. They usually last 10,000 years. We're in one of the longest interglacials right now. All right? We've been in this interglacial now for roughly 12,000 years. It's time that the planet flips back into an ice age. All right? But humans, throughout the last 2.5 million years, have evolved against a backdrop of a much colder, drier planet. All right? The reason why it's drier is because during an ice age, most of the planet's fresh water is locked up into the ice caps. If it's locked into the ice cap, it doesn't fall as rain. And if it doesn't fall, you don't have rainfall, you don't have luxuriant plant growth, you don't have rainforests. Instead of rainforests, you have grasslands, you have tundra. All right? And that was the backdrop for most of human evolution. So just as an example of what happened over those 2.5 million years ago is that the African rainforest, which is the bright green areas, contracted. And instead of the rainforest, there were vast areas of savanna on which grazing animals thrived. So any of you that have seen African documentaries will know the sorts of numbers of those pasture-feeding ruminants. All right, ruminants can eat grass. We can't eat grass. Ruminants can. And it's against this they think that the first early humans or human-like creatures. They came out of the rainforest, down onto the savanna, onto the grassland, and it might have helped if you were upright. All right, instead of being a tree-dwelling animal where you could climb with all four limbs, on the savanna, it might have been useful to have two legs. So we made this transition to bipedalism, walking upright. We have an opposable thumb, which distinguishes a reduction in body hair, an increase in brain size, as I'll come to in a minute, not just its size, but its complexity, its neuronal activity, a decrease in the gut size and its metabolic activity. The gut disappeared, the rumen-like organ disappeared. Oh, I hate these. When they look lovely on a Macintosh and you put them on a PC and they... Yeah, this is one of the first stone tools. My husband collects these stone tools. He's done so since he was a little boy, and so our house is strewn with things that look like rocks, but they're actually very valuable. Why were they made and what were they used for? Well, we know in the first instance they were made for butchering of animals which had been scavenged. Scavenging means that you let someone else you let some other animal do the killing, and then you scare off the animal and you eat it instead. So we think that's at least what happened in the beginning, and that we were using stone tools to cut up the animal. And we can see the objective evidence of that by looking at the bones that were left behind. The bones that were left behind have cut marks on them. The cut marks are not on animal bones that haven't been touched by human beings. So the flaked stone tools were used for slicing. The core stone tools, like that one there, are used for chopping. So the early animal food came from these scavenged animals, and you still see lots of scavenging on the African grasslands. But eventually we became cleverer and cleverer, and we used things, weapons and tools to kill animals more and more effectively. We know that we butchered, as I said, animals because we can see the evidence on the bones. Why did we cut up the animals? Well, we know from Australian Aboriginal anthropology that Aboriginal people couldn't carry a whole kangaroo back to their site where they had their campfires. They would often go off for days, and they would walk for miles and miles and miles, and if they were lucky, they found a kangaroo and killed it, all right? It was the women who stayed back in the campsite and collected small animals and plant foods, and they provided most of the calories. The men went off and had a good time, okay? And some people think that hunting instinct is part of our genetic inheritance, that hunting instinct, and you can still see remnants of it, that we like fishing and we like some Americans still hunt ducks and deer and geese and things like that. And also I think there's some sort of similarity between hunting and sport. All right, we just chase balls these days instead of chasing animals. Anyway, there is truth in saying that women were responsible for collecting most of the calories. But anyway, we know that they cut up the animals because they were too heavy to carry. You gave someone the tail, you gave someone the head, and you cut up the carcass so that it was light enough to carry back. All right, some more about the brain. The brain is what distinguishes the human from any other species. we have an equation which relates brain size to the size of the animal. So for the most part, we can predict how big a brain will be on the basis of the size of the animal. But that equation underestimates the human brain size by 5 times. So our brain is not only much, much bigger than predicted, it's also much more metabolically active, and it has much more of a fraction called the grey matter, the frontal cortex. And this part of us is the most metabolically active. It's the part that's chewing up about a fifth to a quarter of our total energy requirements for the day. So if we just rested, about 1/4 of our calorie usage is coming from the brain. So it's very demanding. So if we developed such a demanding organ, it must have been in the midst of a generous amount of calories being available. All right? But it's also likely that we reduced the size of our gut as well, simultaneously, because that would have meant that we could concentrate now not on energy dilute food sources like fruit and vegetables, but on energy dense food sources like animal food, animal tissues. Okay, so the evidence that we were hunting animals, really big animals, is pretty clear. We see this in the fossil record. We've found spear points lodged in the vertebra of various animals. Sometimes these animals are massive, including mammoths, animals that were twice the size of an elephant. And we couldn't do this alone. We probably did it as a team. And this teamwork may have generated the force that required us to talk, that required us to communicate and to be clever about bringing down such an enormous, aggressive animal. All right, we know that animals are important. About a month ago, I was in Lascaux Cave number 2. This cave was discovered in about the 1950s and was discovered by 2 teenage boys, and they knew they'd discovered something important, and they hid their discovery for about 3 days. Their main teacher, was actually an amateur archaeologist, and they just wanted to tell him they'd discovered this cave. And inside the cave are the most beautiful drawings ever drawn by human beings. It was one of the first evidence that we'd become human. We wanted to draw, okay? It distinguishes us. And of course, today we know there are other paintings that are 35,000 years old, and they happen to be in Australia, okay? The oldest cave art rock art is in Australia. But what they drew indicated the importance of animals to them. And they didn't draw themselves, they only drew their animals that were important to them. But they didn't draw the animal that they were eating most, which was an antelope. They just took it for granted. All right, there's also a debate in the world of archaeology and anthropology about whether we're responsible for the extinction of large megafauna. A lot of people believe we are, and this includes the giant kangaroo, which is about 4 times the size of our biggest kangaroos at the moment. But it's contentious. Not everyone believes we were responsible. The Clovis points left in large animals gives you the evidence, the objective evidence that we were indeed killing these large animals, but whether we're responsible for their extinction is another thing. This Clovis point was razor sharp. They found 8 of them lodged in this mammoth in Arizona. There were no cut marks on the bones of this particular mammoth. and it's assumed that the animal escaped and died somewhere else. All right, this long history of human hunting is shown on this drawing. It was on some pottery. The pottery is 8,000 years old, and what's interesting about this one is it shows that we were hunting with dogs. So our companion animal, the dog, is believed to have played a very important part in the teamwork. And we now know that the first evidence of our association goes back 15,000 years, when they found a child and a dog buried together. So that's interesting in itself. Another objective or another indirect piece of evidence of the importance of the long history of hunting comes from these reproductions in South Africa. It's a cave drawing here. What it shows is a waterhole. It's a South African bushman here. The Kung Bushman, he's at a waterhole. They were very clever. They realised animals needed to come to the waterhole. So as waterholes shrunk, they set up what you call a hide next to the waterhole. The hide was deliberately put downstream, downwind, so that the animals couldn't smell them behind the hide. And they had a little opening, and they'd throw the spear through the opening. All right. So that's animal foods, very important. But what about plant foods? How important were the plant foods? And what evidence have we got about the amounts that were consumed? And this is much, much harder because plants don't leave behind much evidence. All right, and unlike bones and the stone tools used for cutting, the plants don't leave behind much evidence. Although, yesterday I had a conversation with a lady from archaeology here who's looking at the starch residues on stone tools and wanting to analyse the type of starch that's present. All right, what we did a few years ago was look at the remnant hunter-gatherers that were still living in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, because ethnographers, people that study different groups of population groups around the world, they had collected data that showed what they were eating. All right, so the objective evidence of diets, the craniodental features, what sort of teeth we've got. Were they primarily used for chewing, tearing, grinding, or what? And also the wear and tear on the teeth provide objective evidence of what we're eating. The bone strontium to calcium ratio can be used as an indicator of the animal to plant food intake. All right, the ratio of the plant to animal food intake. So we can analyse the bones of humans to determine the likely ratio. We can also analyse the isotopes of C13 and C12, and that indicates the foliage type. It indicates whether we're eating vegetable foods like nuts, or whether we're eating cereal foods, the grasses, such as wheat and rye. We can look at the remains of the hunted animals, their tools and the weapons. We have a subject of study called forensic paleobiology, where they look at the microwear patterns on the teeth. And then we have anthropology and dietary modelling. And I'm going to spend most of the rest of this presentation on this dietary modelling. All right, so that brings us to the recent hunter-gatherers. By recent, I mean the last 200 years or so, okay? They might be called remnant because perhaps they weren't the best specimens to study. Perhaps they weren't typical. Perhaps they had been pushed out of prime hunter-gatherer territory into fringe hunter-gatherer territory. We don't know. But Australian Aboriginal people represent one of the best models of our hunter-gatherer way of life, because they were living that life around 200 years ago. All right, someone called Gray in 1999 published an ethnographic atlas from which we took the plant to animals ratios and extrapolated from that. We published that in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in the year 2000. I'll show you in a minute what we found. We found, in summary, that food selection followed what's called optimal foraging theory. What that means is a really sort of complex way of simply saying we didn't bother to take food sources that took too much trouble. All right? We didn't go down digging a metre deep for a yam if it only yielded 100 calories when it took 500 calories to dig down that far. All right? We chased food sources that were worthwhile, is what I'm trying to say. So, were there any vegans or vegetarians? Were Eskimos, who didn't eat much plant food because they were in a very cold area where there were no plant foods, are they typical? And the Kung Bushman, can you say there's got an exclamation mark before the K? It's a click sound. So in their language, they have lots of clicks and clacks. So their name is actually Kung. All right? And it's quite hard to say. But the Kung Bushmen are still alive and living in parts of Africa, Botswana, and they represent a very special group. All right, so what we did was look at those 229 hunter-gatherer groups that had been studied in Gray's Ethnographic Atlas. These groups did have no agriculture, all right? All their food came from hunting and gathering. And this is a frequency histogram. The frequency is plotted here. You can see the number of groups that had a certain percentage of energy from gathered plant foods. So what this column here in blue says is that 45 of the 229 groups got around 26 to 35% of their energy from plant foods, gathered plant foods. All right, and if you do the sums, the stats, on average, about a third of the energy came from, if you do the stats on this, about a third of the energy came from plant foods. But of course you can see there's a wide distribution there. Only a few obtained more than half of their energy, only a few with more than half of their energy from plant foods. And this was interesting because up to this time, many people, even experts in nutrition, were under the impression that our native human diet was mostly plant food. All right? Is that your assumption? Or have you never thought about it? Lots of people still think that the native human diet is mostly plant food. All right? Then we looked at the dependence on hunted animal foods in these 229 groups, and what it showed was that about 89 of the 229 got about a third of their energy from hunted animal foods. All right? When you look at the average, about a third came from the hunted animal foods. So if you're thinking, you'll know now we've only explaining about 2/3 of total energy intake. So what did the remaining third come from? Fish. All right? We loved our fish. And just like now, we tend to live around rivers and lakes and oceans. All right? We like to have a water view. And on average, people ate quite a lot of energy from fish foods. And there are stories of Aboriginal women who could dive down 10 metres and bring up lobsters and clams and other things. And if you manage to do some sightseeing when you're around Sydney, there are middens all around of Sydney. And middens are simply a nice word to describe Aboriginal rubbish tips. These rubbish tips are full of oyster shells and barnacle shells and things, mountains of them, because it was such a major energy source for them. So this explained the remaining third. And fish are animal foods. So if you look at the total dependence on animal foods, hunted and fished, then on average 2/3 of our energy came from animal foods. It was the opposite of what everybody expected. And when this paper was published, it got a fair bit of debate and lots of letters. And if you look at that, it's actually diametrically different to what we eat now. Our modern diet is about 2/3 plant food and 1/3 animal food. All right? And politically, environmentally, a lot of people prefer it to stay this way. All right? If you look at the dietary macronutrients, which is what we did in this paper, we extrapolated from the Aboriginal bush food database. It was the only wild food database at the time, and it was probably the best indication of the nutrient composition of wild foods as opposed to domesticated foods. And what it showed was that protein intake was higher in hunter-gatherer societies, up to 35% of energy. That carbohydrate was lower. CHO is carbohydrate. Starches and sugars were around 20 to 40% instead of what we eat these days is more like 45, 46%. And they ate a bit more fat. On the whole, they had more fat than we have these days. So, again, the experts were puzzled. And if you look at recommended dietary intakes, they're even more different. Recommended, we're told we should eat more carbohydrate, about 55% of energy or more. We're told to eat less protein, or we're told to eat, we're told that what we eat these days, which is about 15% of energy, is sufficient. And we're told to restrict fat to less than 30% of energy. All right, so if we look at the USDA food pyramid, how many Americans have I got? Many? A few. 4, I think. 4, 5? Okay. Well, the American food pyramid is pretty typical of most food pyramids around the world. You're told to eat lots of bread and cereals, up to 11 servings a day. You're told to eat fruit and vegetables. You're told to eat small amounts of protein foods like dairy products and meat, and of course to restrict oils and sugars. But our evolutionary food pyramid looks more like this. There were no cereals, all right? There were no breads, there was no pasta, there was no rice, and there were no dairy products, all right? Unless you were a child or an infant. And it didn't cut out fruit and vegetables. There were still lots of them, but the bottom part of the pyramid, the foundation, was animal foods, and that included eggs and fish, and even there were nuts there as well, because the nuts were easy they collected on the ground, and there were lots of them. Okay. The foods that weren't in the hunter-gatherer diet were the breads and cereals, the dairy products. There was no added salt, of course. There were no refined cereals. There was no olive oil. There was no butter. There was no sugar, but there's a big but there. They loved honey. They absolutely adored it. And sometimes they went to extraordinary lengths in which to obtain honey. They risked their lives to get honey. Aboriginal people in Australia were lucky because the native bee in Australia does not sting. And so Aboriginal children would find a bee, pick it up, and then they would stick, using a little bit of gum from a tree, they would stick a bird's feather, tiny little feather, on the end of the bee. And then they would track the bee back to its hive, and then they would raid the hive. Okay? And the men did that too. Every time they went on a hunting expedition, they had their eyes open for honey as well. It was called sugar bag. So in my mind, there's nothing exceptional about having a few concentrated sugar calories. But of course we didn't have alcohol. And because it didn't include all these foods, some people would say it wasn't much fun. All right, the agricultural revolution, 10,000 years ago, the last few seconds on the clock, all right, suddenly our planet is warmer and very stable. Lots of rain begins to fall, and that means that it's easy now for us to plant seeds, which we didn't eat before, plant them and see them grow into big grass seeds, and to collect the seeds because for the first time we were growing it in monoculture. So suddenly our diet became narrower. It was based on cereals. Cereals were not part of hunter-gatherer diets. They're too small. The seeds are too small and they were scattered to the wind. They couldn't be bothered collecting small seeds when they had all these animal foods. But what we see in the fossil record is suddenly that we begin to shrink. Our height comes down and our lifespan comes down. Evidence of malnutrition appears for the first time. These are called Harris lines. On the fossil bones of humans, you can see the first evidence of malnutrition. You can also see the first evidence of gender employment, all right? You can see the first evidence that we were sitting down and grinding grains for long periods of time, and it doesn't take much to guess who was doing that. Dental caries appeared. We weren't eating sugar, we were eating cereal grains, which are carbohydrate, mostly carbohydrate, and so dental caries appears. Iron deficiency appears. And infectious diseases. We start to live in large groups, larger and larger groups, and so sanitation and hygiene become important issues, and infant death increases. So the agricultural revolution was a bit of a two-edged sword. On one side, you've got our ability to sit down and remain sedentary and large volumes of food to become available from agriculture, and this might have freed us in order to develop more cultural activity, to start philosophizing and things like that. But it also, when rain didn't fall, it meant famine, all right? Famine appeared after the advent of agriculture. Famine came when a whole crop failed because there wasn't enough rain and there wasn't enough food collected to put them through that period of a few years. The agricultural revolution changed the type of nutrients that we ingested as well. We were eating more starch, much more starch, and much less protein instead. All right? We also process foods more. For the first time, we were milling and refining cereals. Aboriginal people are really good. You'll see these things called coolaments. You can put some seeds, a whole collection of seeds on these coolaments, and an Aboriginal woman can shake this seed. Within about a few minutes, they'll have separated it into 4 or 5 different densities or weights or whatever, on the basis of how she shakes it, so that she can separate the bran from the bits she doesn't want from the bits she does. There was also changes in carbohydrate quality, and this is my area of study, the changes in carbohydrate quality, the increase in the glycemic index, the increase in sugar intake, and novel foods like milk and dairy products were introduced. Novel foods like oil, olive oils, refined oils, and the nutrient deficiencies appeared. And it's interesting to look at these nutrient deficiencies. They include things like iron. And where do you get iron from? Who said that? I can't hear what you said. But animal foods, of course, were the best source of iron, and zinc Animal foods are the best sources of zinc. Calcium, dairy products are the best sources of calcium. Iodine deficiency, which produces cretinism or cretins. These deficiencies are easily solved by eating more animal foods. And interestingly, these deficiencies are the deficiencies which are still common today and still common even in wealthy countries. Australia is in the midst of a resurgence of iodine deficiency. All right, so these problems are solved by eating more animal foods. All right, so you're going to be talking about genes soon. Dietary forces, no doubt, shaped our genome, for better or for worse. And the question today is, why are we so predisposed to becoming overweight and obese? In America, 1/3 of all people are now obese. All right? 1/3, 1 in 3. The same applies to children. Even 2 and 3-year-old children in Australia, 1/4 of them are overweight or obese. So I don't mean to pick on America. Australians are overweight and obese as well. And we're catching up. We're very close to American statistics at the moment. So one of the questions is, did famine select for fatness? All right? Did famine select for fatness? So if that was true, it must have done it over the last 10,000 years, which is not very long. But we know that's long enough. We do know that it's long enough to make a change in the population. So that's why some recent research in this area is so interesting. This gene, the FTO gene, FTO stands for fatness and obesity gene, all right? They were going to call it FAT, but they were told that that wasn't politically correct. Okay, I'm not joking. And this gene was discovered by a genome-wide search for a gene that was present in most people with diabetes and obesity. Okay, they found this gene. It was corresponding to the highest prevalence of highest association. They didn't know what this gene did or what its product, the protein, did. They just knew it was in some way connected. And they found that it had a very strong prevalence in Europeans, and Europeans would have been the group longest exposed to famine because they've been longest exposed to agriculture. All right, agriculture's been around in Europe for at least 10,000 years, whereas in other parts of the world it's more recent. So homozygotes have a nearly 2-fold greater risk of being obese. All right, and lots of us, about half of us probably in this room, are heterozygotes for this gene, the FTO gene, and we have therefore a greater risk as well. But now they're trying to discover what on earth this gene does. And lots of people were hanging their reputations on the fact that this gene would be an indicator of a slower metabolism, that finally overweight and obese people could say, yes, I have a slow metabolism, and that explains this gut, all right? But they were wrong. What they have found is that this gene, even in children, predicts people have a higher appetite. If you put them in a room and you give them a defined meal and then later give them a smorgasbord of foods to eat, the people with 1 or 2 copies will eat more, about 50% more. In whatever you give them, whether it's palatable or unpalatable, they will eat more. So they have a higher appetite. So lots of research, including research at this university, is going into this FTO gene at the moment. The next question is, why is type 2 diabetes so common? Type 2 diabetes is the type that's so common, and it goes hand in hand with obesity, all right? Usually a person with type 2 diabetes is overweight or obese, okay? But there are lots of people that are overweight who never get diabetes. So we wonder whether they go hand in hand or not. But 1 in 4 Australians have diabetes or pre-diabetes. They're immediately high risk. And one of the papers we have published in this area is a hypothesis which proposes that it was the low carbohydrate intake of our hunter-gatherer ancestors which selected for these diabetes genes. So if you have a low carbohydrate intake, maybe it means that you just can't cope with the present oversupply of carbohydrates. And are humans still evolving? The answer is definitely yes. We know that low lactase levels are the norm throughout the animal kingdom. They're the norm in the human population. After the age of weaning, low lactase levels are under genetic control. So as babies, we have high lactase levels, but between the ages of maybe 2 and 5, they gradually decline under genetic control. But about a few of us, maybe less than 10% of the total human population has high levels of lactase. Most of those individuals are Northern Europeans and their ancestors that live in America and Australia. All right? In other words, they're usually Caucasians. And we have high lactase levels throughout our whole lives. So it's proof that dairy products selected for high lactase levels amongst Europeans. So one of the questions I want to leave you with is, can a healthy diet, can a healthy Paleolithic diet be replicated using modern foods? And the answer is probably yes. There are people who've staked their reputations on this. There are popular books on the subject and telling people how to do it. Higher protein intake is now recommended for weight loss. Those of you who are familiar with the CSIRO in Australia will know that there's something called the CSIRO diet, and this diet is based on doubling the protein intake that we currently eat. There's good reasons to double protein intake. Protein makes us feel full. Calorie for calorie, a gram of protein will make you less hungry in 3 hours' time than calorie for calorie, the protein will make you feel fuller for longer compared to carbohydrate or fat. And so the proposal is that it will reduce obesity. So there's lots of research at this university going on that topic at the moment. Wild game meat is not undesirable. It's not full of saturated fat. It's lower in fat, and what fat is there is actually unsaturated fat. And interestingly, Australian meat is low in fat. One of the reasons being that it's not grain-fed under a roof. Our meat is grown on grass in pasture-fed animals. But it's not easy to cut out bread and pasta and rice and sugar and dairy products and alcohol. And most people are very fond of them. So a Paleolithic diet is a diet that's not easy to sustain, and if you can't sustain it, then you're wasting your time. So these are my take-home messages. All right? Dietary forces undoubtedly shaped our human genome. Hunter-gatherer diets were rich in animal foods, fruits and vegetables. And Stone Age people ate more protein and less carbohydrate than we eat now, and that is currently recommended. They ate more protein and less carbohydrate. They didn't eat cereals and dairy products, and diseases such as obesity and diabetes were unknown. All right, when Europeans arrived in Australia, there were no fat Aboriginal people and there were no people that had diabetes. They are products of our modern lifestyle. So the question is, should we recommend a Paleolithic diet to everyone? and I don't have the answer to that. It's very political, it's debatable, it's all connected with climate change and animals and fuel and carbon dioxide emissions and methane emissions, so it's a very complicated topic. And I'm now very happy to answer any questions you might have.